And thank you, Stonington Public Library, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm kind of the warm-up act today because what we're really celebrating is the publication of Charles Hartman's Downfall of the Straight Line. My first correspondence with Belinda about this reading focused on race. I have 3 books focusing on race. The first one, Blue Front, focused on a lynching that my father witnessed as a child. And the second is called White Papers and sort of focuses on what it means to be white in a still racist society. I'm going to read 2 poems from that book. The first one is a Connecticut poem, and it owes everything to a special issue of a special section of the Hartford Courant that was published some years ago and later became a book. This is my piano poem. Black keys from trees, white keys locked on black shoulders, locked together above skeleton ribs, keys to 45 keyboards from one tusk. The word ivory rang in the air. One tusk plus one slave to carry it, bought together. If slaves survived the long march, sold for spice or sugar plantations, march, if not replaced by other slaves, 5 Africans died for each tusk, 2 million for 400,000 American pianos, including the one my grandmother played, not to mention grieving villages, burned women, children left to die, the dead elephants whose tusks went to Connecticut, where they were cut, bleached, and polished. While my grandmother played in Illinois, my mother played, and there were many old pianos, and slaves were used till the 20th century. An African slave could have carried a tusk that was cut into white keys I played, starting with middle C and going up and down. And the other poem from this book, you'll figure out soon enough, I think there's a missing word all the way through the poem. The Irish were not. The Germans were not. The Jews, Italians, Slavs, and others were not, or were not exactly or not quite at various times in American history. Before us, the Greeks themselves were not, though the weaker enemy Persians were. The next up Romans themselves were not either. And later, the Europeans were not, until Linnaeus named by color red, white, yellow, and black. Even the English settlers were only vaguely at first to contrast with natives, but then with Africans, more and more of them slaves, to be irreversibly, totally different from. They were. Then others were not, then were or were not, but gradually became, leaving only for a time black and yellow to be not. Then there were others for those who were still or newly, see immigrant, Arab, somehow not the same, and therefore not. Thus history leaves us nothing but not, like children playing at being something we made, we keep making our whiteness up. So my most recent book is called Casualty Reports. There are a number of kinds of casualties in it. Much of it focuses on coal mining from the time my ancestors were coal miners up until our current climate crisis. But there's also a section on race. And so I'm going to follow up the poem I just read with a poem called Rehearsal. It was written following the death of Jake Adam York, a Southern poet who decided he was going to write about all of the victims of the civil rights movement and era. by going to the places where these people were killed and writing. And then when he died, an untimely death at 39, another poet called upon the rest of the poets to complete his task. So I was going to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the civil rights workers Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodwin were held in jail before they were killed, and where an unknown person, pretty much unknown person named Luther Jackson was killed. So I was actually at the place where this took place, and I did research about it after that. The poem is in 3 parts. Rehearsal. Philadelphia, Mississippi, Luther Jackson, 1932 to 1959. A block from the county courthouse with the Confederate soldier memorial, past the jail where the civil rights workers were held while the Klan assembled in '64. Down Bird to Oak to Water to Pine, past magnolias into sweet gum catalpas, into this dead-end cave of trees, where he parked one night with a girl and passed out, and Officer Rainey found them and ordered him out of the car and pushed him out of sight of the girl, who heard 2 shots and heard Rainey say, "Come down, I think I have killed a..." And then the coroner's jury said, "Justifiable homicide." And Medgar Evers requested an investigation, but the Justice Department said no violation. And 5 years later, they accused Rainey and 20 others of conspiring to kill the civil rights workers. But 3 years later, Rainey himself was acquitted. And 50 years later, the FBI reopened the Jackson case, but found no police, no county records, just newspaper files and relative stories. And anyway, Rainey was dead. Of course, I couldn't have been that girl, but if I'd been the white girl I was and lived here and read the papers, would I have questioned justifiable? And if I'd been here 5 years later and read about the civil rights workers, and decades later when Michael, Eric, Tamir, Philando, and all the others, can I imagine myself in that car at the end of this dead-end street where a man was ordered out of the car and the girl who was with him, who was not me, cried, "You have killed him for nothing." So there's also a section of this book about war, and I'll read 2 poems from that section. Like her body, the world. Hit and hit and hit and hit and fallen. Getting up and trying to get up. Now one part is hitting another part, wounding its flesh, slicing its own veins, breaking its bones. But wait, we are coming. Help is on the way. Now we are hitting the part that is hitting the part. Now it is arm against arm, hand against hand. Now it is eye against eye, no one can see. Now it is ear against ear, there is no mouth. Where is the up to get up to? Where is the body? Where are the parts? Have the parts all fallen apart? We are part of the body, we forgot. We thought we lived outside like a brain in a jar. We thought we were pure like thought, nothing to lose. But we are losing too, we are losing parts. Besides, we were never that brain, we were only a part. We thought we would never fall, but we are falling. Falling and falling and falling, hitting the air. Falling, hitting ourself, our own body. Meanwhile, the body, the world, will try to get up. Or else the body, the world, will lie down. And one more poem from this book. This next poem was written in 2009 at the end of what was then the siege of Gaza. I want to read it as background for what is going on now in the Middle East, but I also want to read it in honor of all the citizen victims of war, including those in Israel, Ukraine, Yemen, Sudan, as well as Gaza and elsewhere. For Gaza. For the woman who cooks on a fire of sticks and boards beside her shell of a house, her bag of clothes in a tree. For physician Ani al-Jarrah, his wife cut in half, his year-old son turned to pieces. For the 30 dead Samuni family members dug out of the rubble. For the living, including children who clutched dead mothers. For the schools and mosques and homes destroyed by bombs. For the graves disturbed by tanks. For the more than 1,300 dead, including those who walked from their homes as directed with white flags. For those going home to water their trees, lemon and almond and olive, and for those trees. And now I'll turn to some new poems from manuscript very much in process. The house where I live. If this gray house where I live, house with a white fence and a red door, where I live on the 3rd floor. If this house were in a different country, today I might have watched from my 3rd floor the building across the street explode, hit by a bomb, which in fact might have hit the house where I live, which if I lived in a different state might have burst into flames from a wildfire fed by climate change, which if I lived in a different country might today have caused floods that might have swept my house away. But as it is, I sit on this 3rd floor in the hottest summer ever recorded and try to keep the air conditioner off while bombs explode and fires and floods surge, far from my gray house with its white fence and its red door. And now I'll switch gears a little bit. This is the working title of the collection I'm working on. There's a reference to a small child in this poem who you can see on the page. He cannot pronounce the first consonant of his words. There's an apostrophe there, which I can't read. Learning lines. Even songbirds learn to sing. They listen to their fathers. We babble our way to syntax. We listen to our mothers. Oh, said my mother, my first word. Without a father, an isolate song. Without a mother. When I took him to watch the planes, the orphan boy said, lean, his 3rd word. The songbird teaches his isolate song. His offspring teach the same song. Bird, said the boy, his 5th word. But after a few generations, the isolate song begins to revert. Live and learn, said my father. But after some years, and with no offspring, the woman in the nursing home said nothing but 5, 5. I opened my mouth and sang. Three more poems, which perhaps could be heard as a kind of sequence. And I hope you do smile at some point. On your wall. The mountains are clouds in the Chinese painting. The houses are flowers, the color of flowers. The flowers grow at my feet. A temple rises into the mountains, but so do the houses, releasing the flowers. Between the mountains and houses, between the mountains and higher clouds is nothing but space which opens the doors of the houses, inviting me, the tiny figure crossing the bridge, to come in. I imagine you remember from some astronomy or other that Ursa Major is the Great Bear constellation in the sky. Arcturus. Because my friend, who knows much about many things, had written Arcturus, I looked up Arcturus, and yes, it's the brightest star in our northern sky. Because my friend made it seem it was complicated, like something more, I kept looking, and yes, it's an aging star, but that wouldn't be it. Then I considered the source of its name, Bear Watcher, which comes from its place in the sky near Ursa Major. But my friend, as far as I knew, had no particular interest in bears. And although another possible source of the name is a myth about wine, and this made me recall some delightful evenings I'd spent with my friend, I decided no, he'd probably written Arcturus only because, if there was a because, of the bright star thing. But by then I'd read that Arcturus was one of the first stars ever named, and that it was called, in various times and places, a pillar of sky, the sword, the pearl, as well as, I thought of my friend again, the owl, and also the star of gladness, the star of joy. And my last poem has a companion that you will hear shortly, which companion will perhaps explain a little more fully the small object described at the end of this poem. Last one up. And then again, as if that tune played on for us, you know the one, the last we played. Turned out the moon was playing too, a big balloon against the busy, foolish sun. That line again, that same old tune. And so it went, with sun at noon and moon at night, till night was done and early sun turned out the moon. By then, though, we'd become immune to shifty time. Once we'd begun, we couldn't stop the throbbing tune our playing made, and in our room, our moon went on, and on it spun our little moon. Our play is done for now, and soon we'll sleep. But first, a task for one, in answer to our one-line tune. Last one up, turns out, the moon. Thank you.
So, hello. I'm going to read entirely from this new book, officially launched a couple of months ago, and I think this is the first time I've read from it in Connecticut. Let in the light. But not too much, right? I'll begin with the first poem in the book, and I'll end with the last poem in the book, and I'll read others in between. I guess that's inevitable, isn't it? The first one is called A Glorious Sky. The clouds look proud because we have to gape so far up. Really, they're confused and disconcerted, herded, riven, with not much time as clouds. How fine that they up there take after us, waiting, demented by brevity, driven askew, evaporating. But what levity, what levity, what a view. Um, a lot of the poems, a lot of the poems in this book uh, seem to be spoken by somebody or something that is, whatever else it is not me. Um, and this one is fairly evidently one of those. It's called Donkey in the Air. While I stood as usual, they added stones to the back of the cart, presumably behind the axle. So, not suddenly, but at some tipping point, the market square began to fall away. Look at that bell tower. Who would have guessed? Meanwhile, the chest, supposed to hang from the firm arch of the spine, ached in harness. The clapper lolled. If I've been sure of anything, it's footing. Now I find less traction than a swimming dog. Could try what the birds do. No. You're gaping. I would too. I have a couple of ideas which unfortunately involve hands. You capped fool with the camera, why not scurry to unload stones, return me to the useful earth? No, this is too much fun. Snap on, develop, print, make a postcard to amuse your tourists from Pakistan to Naples, till it slips into the fist of a Greek who will do a trick to transpose my hung, ridiculously elevated body into a picture of his own village to shame the locals. Then one of you can turn it into words, also good for bandying about. Always glad to be of whatever service in the quarry of your decades. At last, since nobody wants to deal with me dead, somebody starts lifting off counterweights. No plummet, just hind legs, a little kicking, watch the tail, then 4, back in the belonging dust. That's settled. This poem is called The Pianos, and it has an epigraph from the Grateful Dead. All graceful instruments are known. On the same record, they're saying all known instruments are graceful, which is probably a higher probability statement, but all graceful instruments are known. Amid so much sleep, we remember the waking phrases, iterations bored or rapturous, resounding hours, rehearsals of the opulent impromptu, the melody sketched by a right hand once and let drop. We almost remember the 100 hands, thousands of operations, fashioning us for the sleek showroom, the dim loft, the highly favored dorm, the not quite defunct club, solarium, atrium. Among us, we have taught some children what they are. Whether we're grand, the satin titan with mammoth underbite, or upright, but spinet is an ugly name. Everyone has a fall board eyelid. We all need work. My felts haven't been pricked for years. The sostenuto's flabby. A long life can be ghastly, last decades in an untunable basement, peeling, untouched even into noise. Once on a loading dock, Steinway CD 318 and I passed back to back, Gould's own on loan to Evans. This was before the fall. Another I knew stroked Tatum's fingers, then Peterson's, a junker by then with a fresh coat of paint. When monks burned, everyone went dumb for a day. When I first came home under the round window, even as I heard the truck's pads and dollies tucked back in while guys flexed shoulders for the next, on that still first morning, I answered Bach with Bach, and when at last she stood and away from me to speak to some others, I knew her heart was mine. This poem is called Peripheral Vision, and it mentions peripteros. So anybody who's spent time in Greece in the last 50 or actually close, I think, to 100 years, knows about peripteros because the periptero is where you buy everything. This thing out on the street. And they are, or have been, managed by the government and given out to veterans and war widows and so on. It turns out that they're on their way out. There's some finite number of them left, and they're not being renewed anymore. So a whole way of life is disappearing. But that's not really what this poem is about. They just happen to come into it. The poem is called Peripheral Vision. What you see when you don't look at it. Peripheral vision. An optometrist told my father his could have made him a great truck driver. They test for that. Around the curve of the century, I see him at it, a violent road volunteer, long haul and lonely. I see him as peripterist, owner of an Athens corner news and sundries hut, vital to daily life, the neighborhood's central intelligence, a veteran among veterans, the wounded and the war widows. Ensconced like a fighter pilot behind ranks of magazines and chips, bus tickets and sunglasses, books with the spines outward, goods on the outer slopes heaped at the angle of repose, the least expensive, the most visible. Hunched on the stool in his 2-meter cave, room for one, eyes on everything, manning the panopticon, watchful of wares, purchase port on the swarming street, with side slats to guard first and third base. Shelves inside piled to the apex with condoms and cigarettes, guidebooks in the less demanded languages. Everything in reach. At the back, the hatch. It must have been my father who took me to see Violent Road. My mother wouldn't have. Or was it The Wages of Fear, French, with subtitles, which Violent Road remade? In the age of knowledge, no way to know. No one to tell me. I see myself son and heir, and near double in spirit, as in want of those leather blinders for a horse between shafts, to keep it focused, keep it from being spooked. If only not to remember, only I wander out here, street legal, with no commodities, footloose, or as they call it, free. This distance, which has an epigraph that places it on Aegina, the island very close to Athens. It's the first stop on the Flying Dolphins when you leave Piraeus. This distance. If you think you could hear the heat It's probably cicadas you're remembering. At this distance, you don't feel it. Don't be ridiculous. But you put together an angle of vision steeply uphill, and the raw rub of a backpack you gave up years ago, and crushed sage and time, and you are as there as you habitually are where you are. Down below, the sea must be a bathtub, so small are the boats, the smacks and catches, the ferry leaving along its long curve. The notion that you could be there and here is a difficult and necessary dilemma. As soon as you try to assemble words for it and realize you've taken them from two languages, you've lost it again and hold it as fast as anything, any moment you can grasp. Crab Nebula. Everybody knows the Crab Nebula, thing in the sky. That was a. This has an epigraph that places it not in space, but in time, A.D. 1054, which is the moment of appearance of the guest star that, as the Chinese astronomers called it, which we now know as the Crab Nebula. When I, upon the rise of gravity, threw violently around me the gaudiest shawl the universe has room for, when I turned so hard on myself and fast that only flesh substantial as mine could cohere, a self so concentrated that whatever crossed me, I menaced with devouring, when I tortured the very place I turned in, scene of my so recent, long assembled, glorious undoing, and for an hour hesitated on the brink of taking all my brilliance in out of this time entirely. Then I glanced once more at what I'd thrown aside and saw devised in that stuff of my disaster, tissue of worlds, blood of minute beasts, endlessly raveling strew of circumstance, histories strange to mine in everything but plot, all of it certain, all for now still blazing away in such incipience that those far off would strain and say, a cloud. Uh, choosing sides. Not to go to bed, but to stay the night there. We have to work out who gets which. Whose habits stronger decides, except in the happy case where bents agree. This is universal, yet we have no common language for which is which. North or east won't do. Nearer the bathroom and beside the lamp fall short of the particular variety among beds. We'd like to say just right or left, but whose, and lying face up or down? We figure all this geography out as we must. It may take talk, all to the good, being what we do best. This poem is called Moonlight, not Moonlight, but Moonlight, and is is a companion to Martha's poem. Moonlight. Bless her who blessed us with this gift, this bauble, a Pharos paraphrase of Earth's, our satellite, a bubble to make your room a fable of seeing through the night. This 3D printed globe, crater by crater, true, minutely rough as is no doubt the original to the soft hand of God, hankers to show us us. Who knew it was so light, that clinker in the sky, to rest its ounces on a wireframe cube of basswood? Who knew it had a button to switch from gold to rare blue and dim it too? We said this afternoon, looking ahead to night, last up turns out the moon. This one's called We Know, and it's a sonnet um, with lines of somewhat irregular iambic length. But the rhymes are regular, so there are signposts. We know. The time will come, we know, when one of us, catching a summer chill, takes on the full-time, lifelong chore of being ill. Or something sidesteps all that fuss. Some blow we won't have leisure to discuss. One absent-minded footfall on a hill, or too close to a cougar's kill. Soon or late, one will prove the obvious. The other, paperwork and speeches done, will come home to the thought of home, wanting a drink, a kiss, not to be there another year or 20. In that too spacious minimum, at least for a time, there will be time to think back over plenty. It says here I have 3 more poems. That's, for once, I just made a list of the page numbers that I could tune to. So I can't remember. I can't remember what's coming here. This is very exciting for me, if not for you. Oh yeah. Oh yes. Okay. Autumn Ordinance. This poem takes the form of a kind of Homeric simile, just as the snow falls on the shepherd, and just so the Autumn Ordinance. Just as when you keep watch on the ground ahead of where your boots kick up the leaves, the path goes vague and blurred, while if you lift your eyes, the far reach of the trail becomes lucid as map. So when you look at tomorrow through next year, the way otherwise so tangled and burdensome clears. And if the leaves are, as they likely are, fallen from the trees around you, then you get to look deeper into things than spring allowed. A threshold. Very unusually, when this poem says you, it means you. A threshold. When the last of these words fades, where will you go? You'll step outside into the fog that buried the road years ago, where sound dies after a few yards and everything smells mulched. Not that nobody's there. People stumble around selling certificates, grooming their lizards. Only they don't speak or make anything or remember. They breathe fog. Or is the fog inside? Maybe the fields run miles of loam all the way to a city that gleams like a bubble and hums like choirs. Maybe people live out there forever. And the last poem is called I Made a City. And it's a little myth, I guess. I made a city walled in wood and set it in the sea. I named the flood our gravest good and surety. We watched the clouds that are and read the wind for way, living the near to learn the far of the last day. Storm rains cuneiform on wave recorded our long lore. So all we gave we might yet have if we reached shore. I settled us on the tall hill where wisdom rests her soul, and the owl lit on the old sill and made us whole. Thank you. Any questions?
The more time you can take questions up at the podium and people can just ask the question. What if you go up there together? And if you could just repeat the questions when
Yes, good idea.
great, thank you.
That's actually very funny. I just listened to a recording of Julie's talk here a year ago, and I realized near the end there's an audio transcription, and whenever there was a question, you couldn't hear the question, but the audio transcription put in brackets music. Who knew? So any questions?
Carefully. I mean, so many things can go wrong. The lizard that I see there is a fairly large lizard. It could be a Komodo dragon, for instance. And they're famously not happy to be groomed. But it's what you have to do when you're out there in the fog. You got to do something.
You write your moon poems. Yeah.
That depends what you mean. No, is the important answer.
Can I?
You take this one.
I'll take this one.
Yes.
Okay. So we have a slightly different version of the story. He has it in the afternoon and I don't. But one of us, and I don't think you remember which one of us, said, last one up turns out the moon, or last one turns out the moon. And the other one said, that's a great last line for a poem. And scene 2 of this story is, this is in my apartment, and one of us is going this way and the other one is going that way, and we both have notebooks in our hands in which we are writing down said line. So it was a sort of mutual assignment, I guess.
Yes.
Thanks for the question. Anybody else?
I have to go, but I'll ask you a third question before I go. Seems to me Charles is writing poems. Write for him as well. Write for Charles.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Can you repeat the question? It seems that Charles writes for
The last 3 poems
For
seem to
me.
be like, don't fret, dear, that life will get better, that kind of.
so
Or rather, it won't.
so is
But
it, so is
but
it
here
for,
we are.
as if writing for me.
Right.
I think his you is considerably larger than me. And in fact, most of these poems were not written with me in mind at all.
A good many.
Most.
Yeah, probably
Yeah,
most. Right.
So do I write with
The
him?
only one in the whole thing that you could consider autobiography is donkey in the air.
Ha ha. Yes, as
Sorry.
Belinda said, we'll make you smile. I obviously our moon poems are written for each other. Aside from that, well, I guess I have a couple too, but no, I think both of our U's are bigger, much bigger than each other. And as Charles said when he read that one poem, unusually this U is you. Often the you that I'm writing to is me. And in fact, I almost never write a poem that isn't, first of all, to me. My relationship is with the poem, is with the words on the page. If I thought about him, nah.
Right.
He's a great reader, and I respect his opinion, but not while I'm writing.
And the fact is, we didn't even write the two moon poems for each other.
No, not really. We
were both filching from the same pile.
Yeah,
that was
right,
happening.
right.
I read that you written about music and maybe you are a musician. How that
Oh, you repeat
Oh
the
yeah,
question.
the question is, I am also a musician. What effect does that have on, what influence does that have on how I write the poems, on what I write about and so on? Am I paraphrasing you at all fairly? I find the question singularly difficult to answer. I can't imagine not writing poems, and I can't imagine not making music. You would think that I would therefore write lots of songs, but I don't. I've written a very few over the decades, because I think of it as being, I think of these things as coming from two different parts of my brain. That can't be true, but it must be, for me, a useful fiction about how I work, or I wouldn't feel so sure of something so obviously contrary to fact. Martha also has a strong background in music. The other thing I'll say about it is that I always used to tell my students, back when I had students, a poem that you haven't heard is a poem you haven't read.
Yeah, the music of language is what always draws me first to a poem. And often with my own students, they would understand what a poem was about before I did, because I was so busy listening to the sound of the words. And I still do that. I can read a poem with great pleasure and have to read it again to figure out what in the world it's about, because I'm so intrigued by the sounds, by its music metaphor.
If it's a metaphor, and I'm not even,
Yeah, I'm not sure.
not even sure
either.
that
Yeah.
sure that it is.
Right.
You asked particularly about jazz, and I'll say that that's a constant. The idea that what I'm doing is improvising is an absurdity that I find crucial. I mean, it's a story again that I tell myself, and it's a story that I need. I mean, composition, improvisation. What is the relation between them? I've written about that in writing about jazz, but in relation to my own poems, I don't know. You have to add another term, which is listening. What you're doing when you're writing the poem is trying to catch it, right? Now, whether that's improvisation or composition, it doesn't seem to me to matter.
I'm thinking about the way Belinda characterized the two of you, as poets.
It was very, very Manichaean, wasn't it?
And one is whether you recognize yourself.
Hmm.
Okay, we're supposed to repeat the question. I know we should have brought you up here. But this is a reference to Belinda's introduction. And I can't remember the exact words about me, but certainly about, and that is reflected in your comment.
I can't either.
Belinda can't remember either. But it reflected in Julie talking about the ethics of my poems and my situating myself in relation to historical and other events. And Charles, Belinda said, Charles's poems will make you smile. And I realize most of mine don't, but some do, I hope. But as Julie has noted in the question, a lot of Charles's poems are dramatic monologues or persona poems. And I will confess that I have only written at most 3 such poems in my whole life. I, for some reason, don't do that. And that this is a different kind of positioning. I don't know where to go with this. I have just repeated the question, which is more interesting than I think any answer either one of us might have.
So, did what I say make sense to you? My distinction between your work and
I've talked enough.
Oh, don't chicken out there.
It's certainly true of a lot of my work. I hope it's not true of all of my work, but it's certainly, I don't write funny poems. I hope I write a few joyful ones.
Mhm.
But it does make some sense. On the other hand, I think Charles doesn't always make me smile. I mean, your poems. I mean your poems. Don't always make me smile. So if you're talking about tendencies, that makes sense.
I mean, it is true that your poems keep you awake at night.
And might put you straight to sleep.
But yours, when I say they make you smile, with surprise, just not in the kind of funny way,
Yeah.
Right.
but just with that sense about surprise about life, which is sort of quietly joyful.
Yeah.
And I have to confess, I haven't read enough of your work to have found joyful.
Oh yeah. Well, as I said when I began my reading, the correspondence I had with you was about my books about race, and
They're not funny.
they're not funny.
Yeah.
There's one funny poem in all of them, I think. I remember it's the one about underwear, but never mind. But
we just two of us in the room have been reading Seamus Heaney this summer, who struggled with how to address events. And you know, somewhere in Heaney, look out, is that the one where one of the verses starts, no such thing, innocent bystander. And your poetry really reminded me.
well, let me say what happened to my poetry at some point and how I came to be the poet that you're talking about. I discovered some years ago, 20 some years ago, I saw an exhibit of lynching postcards. And I remembered when we were driving through Cairo, Illinois, where my father was born, he pointed to an intersection and said, I saw a man lynched there when I was a kid. And I didn't think too much about that. I thought public executions, which were still legal in this country until 1936. And then I saw this exhibit of lynching postcards, and I realized that what my father had seen, there were a whole bunch of postcards from this particular lynching in Cairo, Illinois, in the north, barely in the north. And I realized what he had seen was a lynching, and I realized there were 10,000 people there. And of course, the primary victim was African American, and I couldn't stop thinking about that. It really changed my life. And I kept trying to write other poems, and this was the big boulder in the road. And that's how I turned to writing that kind of poem. And when I got through with that, I realized I really hadn't finished with the subject, and I really had to think about what it meant to be white. And that thus came the book that I was reading from. So it's not something I started out with, it's something that happened to me. And I think my more recent poems don't do that quite so much, but it was certainly important to me.
Martha is a fundamentally more serious person than I am.
This is not,
I was
So-
trying to find a way to say
this isn't true. It isn't true at all.
of course it's not.
And then if you read that last one again,
If you want me to read it, then people can hear it on.
Right.
There's going to be a lot of music in this recording. Whenever it can't be heard, it's music. Who knew?
Well, I did say that perfect balance.
Yes, you did say that.
Right.
And I do think poetry, and art that delivers both those.
Yeah.
So, your work, both your work.
Right, where those the two masks that represent all of drama, right?
Guess which one I am. Belinda, for the people who think this is music, just repeated saying that we're a perfect balance.
Perfect balance. It might also be the balance of the hedgehog and the fox.
Except that we both think of ourselves as hedgehogs.
Right.
I joke.
The fox and you as the hedgehog. One mode of aggregation, list making, and mustering of evidence is a way of also mustering or controlling anger and rage. And I think of Charles as more I don't know, polymathic or multivalent or multitonal.
Respond?
Does that sound accurate?
Yes.
Okay.
Except that I don't think I write out of anger and rage.
Well, you say you don't write joyful or maybe funny poems, and yet.
I do write joyful poems. I don't write funny ones, but go ahead.
No, the poem, I can't remember, it's they're not and they're not and they're not. That's a sarcastic poem, and therefore there is a kind of strong wit that's coming about, a wit of rage and anger, which reminded me as I was thinking of, or I was listening to it, of D.H. Lawrence's poem, The English Are So Nice. We're nice with you 20 times.
Right.
And realize that this is hammer, hammer, hammer.
Right. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I like that comment about that poem. Thanks. Which I didn't repeat, of course. So you were just so much more music.
I'm going to encourage you to perhaps speak to people in back so that you can sign
Good.
up for any more questions.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank
being
you all
here.
for coming.
Thank you.